Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Alicia Finley and Monet Ukwe-Barua. Let's turn to another big story this week out of Washington, which is the Trump administration's issuing of a memo freezing federal spending on discretionary programs spending that still hadn't gone out the door when the Biden administration left office, Monet. And they issued the memo on Monday, clarified it on Tuesday that it didn't apply to a lot of programs, only to certain programs. And then Wednesday withdrew it amid a huge uproar by Democrats who were saying chaos, craziness, incompetence, and so on. You have to say that some of the criticisms were over the top, but implicitly, by withdrawing the memo, the White House admitted it made a mistake.
Yeah, I think that the entire episode shows the ability of the federal bureaucracy to protect its own interests and protect business as usual, even against President Trump's best efforts to try to slow it down and rein in spending in a gradual way. It's important to look at what the memo actually said, in that President Trump, on his first couple of days in office, issued a whole bunch of executive orders, things like ending DEI in the federal government, that's the diversity initiatives, things like curbing certain environmental spending. And the memo then followed a few days after and said, we are going to pause spending specifically related to these executive orders that Trump has issued. So by no means was he saying, I'm freezing all spending across the entire federal government. But I think that a lot of the employees of these federal agencies saw an opportunity to spin it into a big story and sow a lot of confusion about what Trump was intending. And the press, of course, in a lot of corners picked up on that entirely. And so you saw people asking the White House, does this mean food stamps are going to be frozen? Does this mean that Social Security checks aren't going to go out? Of course, the memo, again, had specifically said this is limited to certain areas where Trump has issued executive orders, but they tried to spin it into a larger story. And I think that OMB, the budget office in the White House, decided that they were in a vulnerable position because of how the story had gotten out of hand, and so decided to withdraw the memo and maybe revisit it, issuing new guidance that will be much more specific about what spending is going to be frozen. But it shows that there is a huge interest group within the government for keeping the spending going, and any action that's intended to pause that is going to be attacked very quickly and very forcefully.
Alicia, the legality of this was called into question by Democrats, saying that it was unconstitutional not to spend money that Congress had appropriated. And in fact, a federal judge did put a temporary injunction against the memo. But as he said, we need to clarify what happened, and then it was withdrawn, so that's overtaken by events. But the litigation will presumably not go forward. But was there anything illegal about what the White House proposed?
I think it's well within the executive's discretion to say, well, let's pause these grant programs. And again, this was a very narrow set of funding. It wasn't even all discretionary grant programs. Some are actually covered by these formula grants to the state, and those were automatically going out. These were things like the IRA loan guarantees, which the president has enormous discretion over. They don't have to send checks out or loans or grants by any certain date or choose any given recipient. Same thing with the NIH grants. There's a whole bucket of these. And again, you're not going to get tremendous savings because they aren't a large share of the federal budget. But what Trump was doing was trying to ensure that these were not advancing the left's agenda with DEI and green mandates. Because recall what the Biden administration did is for a lot of these grant programs, they tied or put certain kinds of conditions on them. Like a company must spend 40% of the federal dollars on advancing environmental justice, or they tried to put essentially de facto racial quotas. And it's well within, again, the president's prerogative and authority to pull that back and remove those restrictions.
I think that there are some people who are coming to the Trump administration, particularly Russell Vought, who will be the head of OMB, Monet, who would like to pick a fight over presidential impoundment power, which is the so-called power to withhold spending that Congress appropriated. And after the Nixon era, there was a big fight in the 70s over impoundment power. They passed the Impoundment Control Act, which says the president must spend money. This wasn't implicated here because, as Alicia said, it was only temporary. They didn't say we're not going to spend any money on these sorts of things. But I think Roosevelt would like to pick a fight legally over the impoundment power and have that go up to the Supreme Court and see if they can't get the Impoundment Control Act overturned to give the president more discretion and control over spending.
Yeah, it's one of those thorny legal issues where the practicality of what Roosevelt is advocating is very clear in the sense that when Congress says we want to, for example, build a whole lot of factories or something like that, we want to subsidize things to support the development of green energy and allots $50 billion to do that. If the executive branch is able to show that they've procured everything that Congress intended for considerably less, they should reasonably be allowed to do that. And as Roosevelt points out, that was the case for most of American history until the Nixon administration when the Impoundment Control Act was passed. But as a legal matter, Congress did decide to go ahead and spell out the fact that when they appropriate a certain amount of money for a certain end, they want the ability to be able to tell the president that every penny of it must be spent. And it seems likely that the Supreme Court would rule that Congress can spell that out if they choose. If there are areas where they want to certainly set a top level for what the president will spend, they can do that too. But I think that Roosevelt is exactly right when he says we should be able to conserve money, and as long as we're carrying out the intent of Congress. But it isn't clear to me whether the law as it stands is unconstitutional. So he can pick that fight if he wants, but I don't think it's necessarily going to result in that law being overturned.
Well, that's a legal debate, legal issue for another day, but it goes to show you, I think, the ambitions of some in the Trump administration to overturn some Washington conventions. But this whole episode of the spending pause that went awry, I think, does show just how difficult it's going to be for this administration to control spending. It will become a political fight every single time they try to do something. All right, we are going to leave it there for today. Thank you all for listening to Potomac Watch. Thanks to Monet and Alicia, and we're here every day. See you tomorrow.